Here we go, 92 PSI, 0 reducers. All right, so after the press test, 35 millimeters of travel is what I have left. 92 PSI with 3 volume reducers. 46 and a half, about 47. So that's about 11 and a half millimeters. I mean, we're not even talking about riding. That's just me pressing into this with 3 reducers. That is a pretty significant difference. Oh! Welcome and thanks for tuning in to another episode of our Back to Basics series. Today we're going to be taking away the notion that volume reducers are only for expert and pro level riders. We're going to show you how to do an installation of volume reducers and give you some insight into what you're going to expect and how you can maximize the tune and feel out of your suspension products. You totally don't need gloves for this. Now that I have a baby, at any point in time I might have to go pick it up, feed it, wipe its butt. I don't want fox oil in my baby's butt, no offense. All right, so first up we want to address that volume reducers are not just for pro level athletes. This is not something that you have to be fast, sending huge drops, hitting big jumps to benefit from.
Dude, I have nothing to prove. Nothing.
Oftentimes we see riders that are in the beginner, novice, intermediate rider level that are bottoming out their suspension regularly, and there could be 2 main elements in that, and we're going to address both of those. But more importantly, we want to show you guys what volume reducers are going to do, how easy they are to install, and where you're going to notice that difference on the trail. So first up, we had a pretty in-depth phone call with Jordy from Fox. He is in charge of setting up and tuning some of the world's fastest racers on their World Cup teams. And we really went in depth as to what he thinks is the best step for setting up suspension. Obviously, number 1 on his list is sag. Always make sure your sag is dialed. He said once a week is about enough to check the air pressure and make sure that everything's seeming right. So we suggest writing it down once you get your setup, all dialed in and you're happy. Write down the air pressures, front and rear, write down your compression, your rebound. Keep it somewhere safe. That way you're always gonna know what your happy spot is. If you go out of town for 2 months and you come back and you've lost 5 PSI and you can't remember your exact number, you got a place to start. That being said, 20% is a good starting point for the front. 30% is a good starting point for the rear. Compression settings, we'll just assume everything is set in the middle and you can adjust from there, but we'll get into bracketing and tuning your suspension shortly. Now, how do you know when you need volume reducers? If you find yourself bottoming out regularly, okay, there's a little bit of a catch here. If you air up way past your 20% sag rate so that you don't bottom out, you need a volume reducer. And the reason for that is you may not be bottoming out, but if you feel like your fork is very rough off the top, if you're compromising on the chattery, washboardy root terrain, and it just feels so stiff at the top of your travel, but you have to run it that firm, otherwise you bottom out, you're a candidate for a volume reducer. If you are a heavier rider, I'm probably saying if you're maybe over that 220 pound range, even if you're at about 200, you could probably take a look and see how many volume reducers are in your suspension products and probably benefit from adding a little bit in there. So essentially what you're doing when you add a volume reducer is you are taking away the volume inside the body there. So if you imagine, as Jordy pointed out, a really big ball, a rubber ball inflated to 100 PSI, and you tried to squeeze it, you would have a lot of give. If you had a much smaller ball at 100 PSI, you wouldn't be able to compress that ball so much. And the theory is the same inside this fork. So when you stack these tokens, or sorry, these volume reducers inside that fork, you're effectively reducing the air volume inside, which is gonna make the fork more progressive and ramp up towards the end of travel. The benefit is that it doesn't really do a lot at the beginning of the travel, so you don't have to overpressure your fork or run a higher spring rate to keep you from bottoming out and lose that sensitivity off the top. So you can really maximize that traction feel, keeping that front end on the ground, not abusing your hands when you need it. And then when it comes time to hit a big drop, land a big compression, you know that the fork's gonna progressively ramp at the end and keep you from having a harsh bottom out experience. Cue Huck to flatten. So now that we've established who some prime candidates are for volume reducers, we're gonna show you guys how easy it is to install them. Typically, products will ship with at least one, sometimes two, depending on the brand, what product it is. But essentially, this is your volume reducer. They work fine individually, or you can just slide them together if you need a more progressive ride and you need more progression and ramp up in your travel. So we'll show you guys real quick how to put that in your fork. Very similar process as well in the shock, and we'll show you guys how to do both. You want to ensure that your bike is relatively clean. Suspension products have to be clean inside, so we went ahead and washed down our Specialized Levo and got the fork all clean, made sure there wasn't any dust or mud or grit gonna fall in there. Next up, you are going to need a shock pump. Doesn't have to be a digital shock pump, but we find that these are the most accurate and work the best. Write down your shock pressure and fork pressure. Again, don't want to forget them. Air down your suspension. That is always a very, very important step because there is a lot of pressure inside these chambers and you don't want to have any accidents when it comes time to go removing anything. So slowly gonna air out. Now that we've aired down, we've written down our pressures, you're going to need a 32 mil socket. We are lucky enough to be down the street from Abbey Tools. They specialize in making some really awesome product to service suspension and a lot of other bike parts. Fox also makes a flat socket. The key with a socket here is to not have a chamfered edge. You can see that these sockets are flat at the bottom because there's not a lot of height on the sides here. So a chamfered socket will possibly round out the edges because it just won't have enough purchase to loosen up all 8 sides of this bolt. All right, so air pressure's out. Once again, we've used our flat socket. Boom, there it is. This is the top cap for the air side of our leg. As you can see, no volume reducers are installed. Really easy. Anyone can do this. You do not have to be a pro mechanic. Simply slide this indexed portion of your volume reducer onto this little index portion of that. It will click in. Boom, done deal. You can incrementally try to increase the volume reducers, and that's what I would probably suggest doing. You always could do a bit of a bracketing test, put 2 in, see if that's too firm and you never get full travel, or you might be right on the money. So for the sake of speeding up this video, we're gonna go right to 3 volume reducers instead of doing it one by one because I know 3 volume reducers is what I like to run in this fork. Being that it is an e-bike, has a little bit more mass, I usually find I need maybe 1, sometimes not, but sometimes I'll need more than 1 volume reducer over my regular bike setting. So we'll get that on there, snug this up, and then air back up to 92 PSI. Like many things on your bike, There is a torque specification. We'll just assume that most of you don't have a torque wrench. This is holding air. There is, however, a rubber seal around the top of that. So you want this snug, but you do not want to over tighten it. Another thing to note, when you are putting air in suspension, front or rear, anytime you're airing up or airing down, you will want to equalize the air chambers. And what that means is that as you pump it up, you will need to give some micro compressions so that air can go through pass through the orifice into both the positive and negative chamber. So typically I'll pump this thing up to maybe about 10, 15 PSI, give a couple compressions. You only need to go down about a centimeter or so, and you'll actually be able to feel where it bypasses into that other chamber. And just do that a couple times just for peace of mind, and then continue pumping up. And I'll typically do it one more time on my way up just to make sure I'm good to go. And after that, hop off. I'll check my sag, make sure it seems right. And then again, because I'm paranoid, I will put the pump back on, make sure I'm still in my happy spot. 92 PSI, I am good to go on my fork. Next, we're going to add some volume reducers to the rear shock. This is something that can be done on the bike. Obviously, some suspension designs make it harder to get to than others. If you've got a bike where a shock's relatively exposed, it's super easy to do, just like the fork. But just for the sake of showing you guys, getting a little bit better visibility, we have two shocks off the bike, DPX2 and a Float X2. We're gonna show you how easy this is. Much like the fork, if you're riding too low in the travel, you're gonna have a low bottom bracket, you're gonna be striking pedals, you're not gonna let that fork or that shock work effectively. And they're just gonna be blowing through travel way too much. It's gonna be way too harsh of a ride and just not gonna be fun or a good experience. And then if you air it up too high, you're just gonna be skipping over the back, your feet are gonna get tired and fatigued, and tires gonna be skipping and drifting all over. Just like the fork, step number one, air down. Always let the air pressure out of your shock before you service or check or do anything. Then what you're gonna do with the DPX2 is simply grab a hold of it, and this is why sometimes it's actually easier to do when it's on the bike. Get a hold here around the reservoir on the top, and you're just gonna unthread the can. Just grab a hold of the can, twist it, unthread it, and then you're gonna get access to this upper chamber here, which is where the volume reducers live. This one we just pulled apart before we started shooting, but it had a 0.4 from the factory. That was what this particular bike called for, what the product managers decided was the best tune for the average consumer and rider. Now, if you are outside of that weight range, that riding style, etc., that's where these volume reducers are gonna come into play. So Fox does sell a kit, and they go 0.86, 0.6, 0.4, and obviously they also go up to over 1. As you can see here, each of these volume reducers is a different size, and as you can imagine, once they go inside this shock body, the bigger that reducer is, the less volume is inside that shock. Obviously what that means is, as you compress that shock, the harder it's going to get, which means more progression, more ramp, less bottom out. When installing the volume reducer, it's really easy. Again, you want to be careful if you do get in here to remove the factory one to size up, and you use something like a screwdriver or a pick or anything like that. Really, really be careful not to mar anything, the shaft, not to damage any of the rings. anything like that. Slide the volume reducer around the shaft there, and you're going to place that down. It will click into place. Super easy, ready to go. You can just slide that stuff up, and after that, you're just going to slide the can up, thread it back on again snugly. You'll want to get that thing in there pretty tight. Air up, and again, when you're airing up, once you get a few 10 psi in there, compress it a little bit on the bike, let it pass and equalize, put air into positive and negative chambers, then pump up, check your sag, give it a ride. The Float X2, which is what's on my Levo here, is slightly more complicated, but not much. So first things first is there's this little spring retainer clip here. That's at the top. You're gonna wanna get in there, remove that. You might be able to do it with your fingernails. It is something you can do trail side. If you've got a little pick or something, that might make it a little bit easier to get that out. After you get that clip out, you're going to slide this up over the rebound adjuster, and that will show you the volume reducers. So as you can see, this shock here is pretty loaded. It's got quite a few in there. 4 is what it's looking like. So installing volume reducers in this shock, pretty easy as well. What's neat is that they're in 2 pieces, so that does make it easier to put them on if they're in the bike, as you can just slide in half and half from each side. But essentially what you're gonna do here is just slide these in, click them into place, and there you go. Depending on the shock, there is a max number of volume reducers, so you will want to check. I believe if you go to ridefox.com/bike/help, that's going to be your website of choice. They will give you specifications, tips, tricks. They'll even have some videos and let you know kind of max pressures, suggested settings, max volume reducers, etc. So once you get those bands in there and clipped together, you are good to go. You're gonna wanna push this back down and over, seat it down into place. Then you're gonna reinstall this little clip here and air up. Once again, once you get a few PSI in there, let it equalize by compressing the shock a little bit, air it up back to your riding weight, check sag, and go ride. Did not bottom out, and I tried pretty hard. Now, one last thing worth mentioning is don't give up, right? Now, you may have established habits around your old riding style and setup, and quite frankly, they could be bad habits. Those take time to break. Don't go out one time and give up because you think it was weird, because there could be a number of things going on. And something that Jordy from Fox really helped drive home with me is that oftentimes people who maybe were running way too soft, way too linear of a fork, were riding so low in their travel that they felt skittish, they felt unsure because the front end was so low. They started going shorter stems, they started going with higher stack heights, more steer tube spacers to try to get them farther up and back. If all of a sudden you put more volume reducers in and your fork is now staying high in the travel, and then you exaggerate that even further with your new cockpit setup, you're gonna be way off the back, having a really hard time maintaining front end traction. So don't just throw everything out after one ride. If it didn't feel good at first, try it again. Then you can start with your bracketing process. And what we mean by that is ride it as it is, go up to with compression, steer tube spacers, whatever that might be, right? And try to isolate it. Don't make 3 changes and then go try it, because then you won't know what change was the one that made it better or worse. That's something that's gonna really maximize your efficiency, your performance, your safety out on the trail, and it's gonna let you ride faster and harder. Thank you guys for watching. We appreciate you. Hope to see you out on the trails.